In this video, I'm going to be philosophizing on existential questions. Within the journey of within one's being, one may will questions concerning meaningfulness, be it exploring not whether or not there is some meaning in life per se, yet whether or not there is a meaning to one's existence that is meaningful to the self and or worth the responsible conducts future-oriented to engage the creations of an individual's intrinsic values, liberating one's freedoms to hold meaningful values in relation to the evaluation of meaning in one's existence. Exploring questions within one's originality to articulate original questions, not some questions some other individual has called upon you to answer, yet you may, within your explorations of prior existing badly articulated terms to more gooder articulate your well-defined complete questions to complete sentences of response, willful within the meaningful utterances of thought, you conductively conduction within your nervous system, the innervations within being of what you willfully mean in relation to your values to most connect meaningful questions, not arbitrary questions and questions lacking meaningfulness. To think on what's meaningful and to calibrate your mind to explore meaningful questions willfully. Engaging more one's intrinsic openness to exploration as one is more able to, from the prior existing certain arbitrary values, one characterizes distinct internal and or external characteristics to think one may perhaps cultivate some self-knowledge and or self-awareness to infer within the unknown unknowns a minute, proportionate sample of intrinsic processes and or intrinsic properties meaningful to infer causations, meaningful to the self to conduct one's affairs creatively, originating some inventions and or innovations and or existing creative solutions to prior existing blocks in one's life, perhaps creative ruts and or uncertainties in relation to more clear desires one needs to satisfy, and yet feels one is more at a loss for the direction forward, lacking the necessitated satisfaction of necessitated needs, not necessarily the essential needs, yet perhaps the satisfaction to the essential needs in one's existence is bland and deprives one's being of individual autonomy. The philosopher Nietzsche contributed deeply to various more meaningful passing of various human rights and or freedoms legislations from his philosophizing on individual autonomy, more unique in terms of his thinking of the meaningfulness of articulating your own thoughts and perhaps willing your values, yet he more admired individuals who had forged their unique wills, yet was himself often not necessarily skeptical, yet more in lieu of his depressions felt the will may not truly hold a unique existence, and existencia that's meaningful for the creations of value one may perhaps not necessarily hope for, be it that hope ironically proactively engages one's will. Yet he was more optimistic of the possible existência de vontade, concerning the thoughts he originally instantiated in terms of the Übermensch, the individual whom he projected his future-oriented thinking ability into philosophizing what he had seen from certain individuals more privileged and of rank, whom had lived more calibrated to their unique, meaningful utterances of thought, willful of the certain values and or meanings within one's existencia, meaningful to the elaborations of one's articulated, valued communications within one's corpus, to be able to draw from the unique vocabs one may communicate what allowances positive, meaningful emotions to be elaborated, engaging meaningful experiences from those positive, meaningful emotion elaborations, satisfying certain underlying psychological needs, liberating the self in relation to one's individual autonomy, most meaningful to human rights and or freedoms. Ironically, all the central fathers of existentialism kept journals and or contributed to 5 secret ingredients to existentialism, be it agency, be it freedom, be it meaning in life, be it human rights and or freedoms one wills from one's often most concern with individual autonomy, each contributing some meaningful contribution to the instantiation of laws subsequent and or directly and or indirectly from certain publications meaningfully concerning human freedoms and one's condition, associated with the cultivation of one's own necessitation of the need for individual autonomy, be it that no one's truly more concerned with individual autonomy than the self whom is concerned for one's own individual autonomy, confronting often the absurdities of one's existencia in relation to the meaninglessness and or arbitrariness and or pointlessnesses within the exposures to the absurdities, one may not have a solution for the expectation more optimistic, yet to be confronted with the irrationalities of often others more realistic in the calibrated thinking. One is more likely to be the individual responsible for advocating on behalf of the self for the creations of human rights and or freedoms, not waiting around for another individual to come and save one. Meaningful to will values and to contemplate the fifth most meaningful secret ingredient concerned with death, be it you may not be a human when you die. Lacking and ceasing your consciousness perhaps may never, be it you come to an awareness in some reincarnation, more improbabilistically would be most lucky to experience another human existencia and or an existencia with some sort of complex intellects and or intrinsic creativities. You may originally communicate your valued, meaningful utterances of thought unique to language. In the language you allowance the complex, complete sentences, not the individual, meaningless sound bites, truly not meaningful without the complete sentences to provide the philosophical definitions within the depths of the original instantiations derived from its etymological origins, the analytical units of analysis, connecting the phraseologies unique to the self from meaningful babbles of thought, attempting most meaningfully to communicate some essential underlying psychological needs relevant to the desire to engage semantic processes and or behaviors. Compared to animals whom we often anthropomorphize, thinking that within the anthropomorphizations we are more clever in being able to eavesdrop in the secret languages of other animals, yet often forget that language here is a metaphor and not necessarily actually factually what constitutes language communications, and tends to be more reliant in inferences to certain communications, inferring nonverbal and some more primitive semantic processes and or behaviors, with a deep failure to appropriately communicate complex phraseologies and or meaningful utterances of thought with accuracy and the most meaningful approximations we are allowanced within complete sentences of communications and or paragraphs and or books of texts that contain the practical wisdom of like 10 individuals 2,000 years ago whom from those 10 exponentially developed the elaborative popularity of literature, often forgetting the recency of books in terms of being easier to access and or evaluate knowledge within what is now available to nearly every individual, not a select few, and not a select few whom may publish, meaning that prior to the printing press, it was only a handful of individuals whom were committed, not necessarily always elite individuals, yet individuals who were privileged enough to have some access to education to write and read, forgetting often how the most meaningful experiences were provided by the original meaningful work done by teachers whom allowanced individuals to read and write, and the transformative impact it had within the last 100 years, popularizing the public school, providing quality education to liberate minds and increase awareness into the meaningfulness of cultivating one's own self-knowledge and or self-awareness to think for oneself within writing and or thinking critically of what one consumes within reading, engaging the complexity of semantic processes meaningful to conduct one's meaningful living, willful, compared to animals whom communicate certain paired associations of vocalized sounds. Certain salient sound bites are paired to certain nonverbal communications, lacking the complexity transmitted with the written and recorded terms. Analytic terms derive certain calibrated, as a must be good enough and necessary conditions, codified phonemes of the component parts and or processes within the lettering of certain analytic terms to connect the meaningful analytic meanings directly and or indirectly associative analytic meaning interpretations, calibrate one's subjectivity to perceive what one thinks one means in relation to certain well-established self-knowledge and or self-awareness, calibrated to more objective and or functional and or meaningful intrinsic processes and or intrinsic properties concerning the prior existing learning of language from written and recorded communications and or indirectly from written and or recorded communications. Most meaningful language processes derive from the cave wall paintings to the codifications of what one means in terms of the calligraphy one calibrates to an image, the coded sound bites one codes, vocalized meaningful utterances of thought to certain images to communicate multisensory experiences within more meaningful intracategorical and or intercategorical effectivenesses and or efficiencies, to elaborate the complexity within an incredibly short amount of time and or with less costly expenditures to mind-body connections, the self wills communication, compared to the birds whom are likely the most meaningful, best candidates for inferring complex, not necessarily language, yet more song-based semantic processes and or behaviors meaningful to provide communications to other birds whom are more familiar with certain bird songs and may meaning interpretation certain bird songs, yet not necessarily all bird songs and or most bird songs, to mean certain bird songs are more like different languages, yet are still unique to what one may meaning interpretation within certain vague songs compared to well-defined written clear communications within non-fiction books, engaging the self-disciplining of one's thinking to clearly communicate certain intrinsic processes and or intrinsic properties to allowance more complex and or precise approximations of music in terms of holding certain meaningful similarities, not just in terms of the interpretation one has, yet to be able to play the same song and yet play the same song distinctly, to treat it as the same, never quite truly the same within one's subjectivity, to within that process engage self-conducted learning, to elaborate what one had not held within one's self-knowledge and or self-awareness, more closely attuned to what the song most likely represents and or connects to certain themes and or its inception within the incipient will of the artist, whom is a musician and not a visual artist and not the artist of the pen, to distinguish musicians not to mean artist, to mean musician, as often musicians are conflated with artists. And I think this is deeply incorrect, as artists whom were the first to take the blood of animals and with the hands paint symbols on the wall of the cave to represent attempts to meaningfully communicate one's thinking, expressing certain frustrations from the absurdities and or meaningless experiences from prior existing arbitrarinesses and or pointlessnesses within attempts to communicate perhaps to meaningful others or ones whom one had thought were meaningful, to bring into one's willful creation from arbitrary values, existential values, to make some other go, huh, what is that? And to elaborate, well, this is what I mean. And the other may think, well, I've never seen that. And one may be able to elaborate and think, well, I've never quite had such a deep communication with another individual until I did that thing on the wall with the blood of the deer I had consumed and attempted to draw a tree by a log with me sitting down, and now it just kind of looks like two lines with an attempt to create a circle. And I realize that that's quite not at all what a tree looks like. And my attempts to communicate that, be it better than yesterday, is not quite as clear as I had thought. Yet still, meaning emerges from the arbitrary values, and within the future-oriented efforts to engage more responsible conducts, from arbitrary values, more meaningful values may emerge and or be synthesized from connecting distinct component parts and or processes from one's existing priors, meaningful to the elaborations, most meaningful to the self. That's all I want to say for this video. Hope you have an awesome one. Keeping those out flash.